Actually, I requested to give two presentations, one an introduction to cryonics and cryonics technology, and another presentation dealing with technical challenges in cryonics. And this has been merged together into one lecture, and so there'll be both introductory material and technical challenge material. Now, let's see, I guess I'm not sure where to stand back there to not block anybody's view. Shall
I maybe, you can go up front, give me a signal, and I'll switch the slides.
All right.
And if the people from the back are asking if you can stand up to the microphone.
Okay, how's that? Okay, so you practice clicking?
Well, shall I now? Because
yeah, forward and backwards. Try clicking backwards if you can.
I don't know about backwards.
Previous.
Yeah, well, I don't have a mouse.
You can hit the up down.
We'll try if we can go only forward.
Page up, page down. Page up, page down.
I'll just
go over there.
move myself over to here.
Page up, page down.
Yeah.
So hit page up just to go to the first. That's it. Now page down. Okay, so the first introductory thing to do is to say what cryonics is, and so it's a practice of preserving legally dead humans and animals at cryogenic temperatures in the hopes that future science can restore them to healthy living, as well as rejuvenate them so that they can live hundreds of thousands of years in healthy, youthful condition. So I've underscored and made rejuvenate larger because I think it's really key. Really key part of the program. There's not really much point for a lot of people in rejuvenating and bringing them back after they're 80 or 100 years old. That's one of the large problems a lot of people have with this idea. The first thing they think of is, oh, why would I want to be brought back when I'm still old and sick? And it just misses the point entirely. It's the prospect of rejuvenation which has driven the excitement about the possibility of cryonics working. And I try to emphasize that more and more so that the public understands what it is we're trying to do and where we're trying to go. So, the next slide. And cryogenics is a word often confused with cryonics, but it actually applies to, the field of physics or engineering that deals with low temperature. What that low temperature is, it varies. Some definitions say below 100 degrees Celsius, some say below 150, sometimes they say below 100 Kelvin. Anyway, it's very low temperatures. It's related to cryonics, but it certainly isn't cryonics. Next slide. So we're expecting and hoping that future medicine is going to be able to cure every disease, and as well as rejuvenate people. And so cryonics is going to be the ambulance we take to the future, and so we call the people in that ambulance patients. And I've emphasized rejuvenation over and over, but it may take many decades before we have rejuvenation, and people may die before that time. So that's why we need the ambulance. And there's also some damage in the cryopreservation process that's going to need to be fixed. So cryonics is really based, people say cryonics isn't science, and to that extent it's true. It's not science. You can't say something is science when it's based on things that don't currently exist. But it's very reasonable to believe that the repair technologies that we require will exist, and the rejuvenation will happen, and we'll be able to repair a lot of the damage that's happening. Next slide. Another key aspect of cryonics is the cooling aspect. We know that food can be preserved in a refrigerator or a freezer. So the lower the temperature, the better the preservation. Children who fallen in cold water have survived over an hour of cardiac arrest with complete neurological recovery. So that's another example of preservation. Next slide. The decomposition is partly due to biochemical reactions, and they're typically enzyme catalyzed. And cooling can slow these reactions, and the extent to which they're slowed is determined by the Arrhenius equation. Next slide. The Arrhenius equation tells us that at 0 degrees Celsius, a reaction will go about 1/18 this time as fast as it will go at 37 at body temperature. Or stated another way, the reaction goes 18 times faster, 20 times faster at body temperature than it does at ice water temperature. Next slide. And carrying that logic further, you can say the reaction goes 400,000 times faster at body temperature than it does at dry ice sublimation temperature, and 10 to the 28th times faster than it does at liquid nitrogen temperature, the boiling temperature of liquid nitrogen. And essentially, nothing is happening at all. 10 to the 28th is just, astronomical. Next slide. Water molecules interact by hydrogen bonding primarily. The hydrogens form hydrogen bonds. They aren't covalent bonds with the oxygens. And the natural tendency of water molecules is to arrange themselves in a tetrahedron with these hydrogen bonds. Next slide. And but in the water phase, the tetrahedron can't be easily formed, and so the water molecules sort of jostle around and next to each other. But when you form ice, they form this very nice tetrahedron crystal lattice, and this occupies 9% greater volume than the liquid form does, which can be a source of damage. Next slide. Damage by mechanical crushing from the freezing damage from the ice is a major part of the problem that ice causes. But there's also osmotic damage, electrolyte damage, and maybe even dehydration damage. So we want to avoid ice formation if we possibly can. Next slide. By analogy, quartz, silicon dioxide, actually arranges itself in a similar sort of tetrahedron with silicon in the middle and four oxygens around. And so that's an example of quartz, the quartz crystal. Next slide. But if you can get some sodium ions in between that lattice into the crystal, you end up with an amorphous form of quartz. And that's exactly what we have in our window panes and our drinking, our vessels for drinking, beverages, beverage vessels. Anyway, glass. The glass that we're familiar with is quartz with soda lime and calcium oxide that's breaking up this regular crystal formation. Next slide. So the window panes are made of, and the containers for beverages are typically made of this soda lime glass. It's not a crystal, and if you've ever watched a glass blower, you'd see that the hot glass is a syrup that as it becomes cool, becomes more and more viscous and thick, and finally turns into a solid state. And the solid state is essentially a very, very viscous liquid in a sense. And if you do that, if you get this vitrification, glass formation, you avoid the problem of the tetrahedron formed of the ice and the mechanical crushing and so forth, as well as the other problems. Next slide. And the way we do this is comparable to what we do with glass. We use antifreeze compounds as cryoprotectant, and they get in the way of the hydrogen bonding by the water molecules by hydrogen bonding and ligative action themselves. The most common one that you may be familiar with is the ethylene glycol, which is the antifreeze that's used in automobiles. But propylene glycol has been used in ice cream to prevent ice formation, and glycerol has been used for over 50 years to prevent ice formation or reduce ice formation in red blood cells and sperm. And dimethyl sulfoxide is the cryoprotectant that's most preferred by cryobiologists. Next slide, please. So there's been some great achievements with vitrifying biological tissue. The rabbit brain has been vitrified with no ice seen anywhere by electron micrographs. hippocampal slices have been cooled to solid state and rewarmed, and not only showed no ice formation, but 100% viability. So that's two things you're trying to accomplish with ideally, is not only eliminate the ice, but show that tissues can be completely alive. And the fact that it's hippocampal slice in the brain is all the more encouraging. The greatest achievement to date of vitrification is a rabbit kidney cooled to a solid state, vitrified, and rewarmed and transplanted into a rabbit, and able to sustain the rabbit as the sole functioning kidney. Next slide. So just to re-emphasize, vitrification is glass formation, and we can get vitrification of water using cryoprotectants, but cryoprotectants are toxic. Next slide. Really, cryoprotectant toxicity is the #1 problem standing between us and reversible suspended animation by cryopreservation. There's some problem with perfusability. If you wanted to perfuse bones don't perfuse very well because they don't have much water in them. But on the other hand, the fact they don't have much water means you don't get ice formation or much damage. So bones aren't really as big a problem as you might think. Kidneys are actually one of the hardest organs to vitrify because of a perfusion problem. The medulla, the inside, only receives 2% of the blood flow, whereas the cortex receives 98%. So it's this uneven blood flow in the kidney that makes kidneys so hard. And in a sense, it makes it encouraging, the fact that they have been able to vitrify a kidney. The brain is, by contrast, it's actually one of the most easy organs to vitrify. If we could vitrify without toxicity, it would be a huge benefit to cryonics. I mean, if we could demonstrate whole toxicity by introducing the cryoprotectants at a lower temperature, because they tend to be less toxic at lower temperature. And also, if you can find a way to cool faster, you can use lower cryoprotectant toxicity concentrations and thereby lower the toxicity problem. And that's one reason why it's easier to vitrify a rabbit kidney than a human kidney, because a rabbit kidney is smaller. That means you can cool it much faster. Another thing about the cryoprotectants is if you use them as single agents, they tend to be more toxic than if you mix them. So we try to get different cryoprotectants and mix them together, and then you can use lower concentrations. And you can add ice blockers, that helps too. Next slide. I guess many of the critics say, oh, that you're just doing this to dead people. So what does that mean? It doesn't help you. And so what is death? Before 1950s, people believed, it was believed that if your heart stops, that's it, you're dead. That's the end of the story. And then it was discovered that people could be brought back to life with CPR, or defibrillation, if it was applied within 6 minutes of the time the heart stopped. But there's a misconception that after 6 minutes the brain is destroyed. All the neurons die immediately from the ischemic damage. But that's not what happens. It's the blood vessels that are damaged after 6 minutes, not the brain cells. And if nothing can flow through the blood vessels properly, no wonder you can't revive the person after 6 minutes. Next slide. So actually, in 1976, Peter Safar showed that he could go back beyond the so-called 6-minute limit. He could perfuse dogs. Dogs survived 12 minutes of cardiac arrest just by some manipulations to what he was perfusing with. Elevating the arterial pressure with epinephrine, using heparin, little hemodilution with dextran 40. And just by increasing cerebral perfusion pressure alone, the 6-minute limit has been extended to 12 minutes. Next slide. So actually, neurons can tolerate quite a lot of ischemia, it turns out. After experiments with rats stopping the blood flow to the cerebral cortex, after 6 hours, only 15% of the neurons were necrotic. And similarly, autopsies of elderly humans, autopsies done an average of 2.6 hours post-mortem, The cells, the neurons had 70-90% viability after 2 weeks in vitro. So the neurons are actually pretty darn durable compared to the blood vessels. Next slide. We do want to begin, I'm going to talk about the whole sequence of cryonics, or cryonics practice or procedures. In a good case, you'll begin immediately after pronouncement of death. You only have a 6-minute limit if you can start cooling right away and circulation right away. Give medicines, heparin against clotting, usually restore the circulation and cool in an ice bath. Replace blood with vitrification solution and cool quickly to just above 923, which is where the solidification occurs of the vitrification mixture. Then cool slowly over several days to with the nitrogen temperature and restore the connection. And the last step, of course, hopefully there'll be reanimation and rejuvenation in the future. Next slide. So there's a number of cryonics organizations. The two big ones that have been mentioned is Alcor in Arizona and the Cryonics Institute in Michigan. And currently, as a current date, both these organizations have 100 patients, and the other organizations have a fewer number of patients. There's also an organization, Suspend Animation in Florida, which does not store patients. They just do the standby and stabilization part. And they actually, Suspend Animation has actually been doing most of the, certainly a major part of the standby and stabilization for Alcor, and they have a contract with many Cryonics Institute members, but they only operate in the United States. Next slide. So Alcor will either preserve your whole body or your head. They call it preserving the head neuro, and they charge different prices for whether they do your head or your whole body. The Cryonics Institute has a policy of only preserving whole bodies. We don't give you a neuro option. On the other hand, we do have different ways of doing perfusion. We can perfuse only the head, or we can perfuse the head and the body independently. And we use a different perfusion solution. We use VM1 for the head and glycerol for the body when we do them both. Now, we charge the same price whether you want one or the other. People can say, I just want the head or do both. We currently recommend that they only do the head. But anyway, many people want their body perfused. Even though it's not possible to eliminate ice formation in the body. We can vitrify the brain, but we can't vitrify the body. We can just cut down the ice formation a bit. When Alcor perfuses the whole body, both the head and the body are perfused together. Next slide. There's some problems with trying to vitrify with perfusing the whole body. It sounds great that we would certainly want to perfuse the whole body or vitrify the whole body. If we were able to vitrify the whole body, then there would be a possibility of people getting up and walking away after being cryopreserved. But we're a long way from that now, and there are a lot of problems with trying to vitrify the body. At Alcor, if you're trying to perfuse the whole body, it takes longer. You have to vitrify all the organs, or try to saturate all the organs with vitrification solution, even though you're not vitrifying them as best you can. So that means the brain spends a lot longer being exposed to this toxic cryoprotectant. And the vitrification saturation can't be monitored separately from the body and the brain. So you're really sort of guessing at what the saturation of the brain is, and when you're doing the body. At the Cryonics Institute, the neck vessels shrink. If you try to perfuse the body first, the neck vessels shrink, which makes it harder to cannulate and perfuse. And there could even be seepage of glycerol in the brain from the body if you perfuse the body second due to collateral vessels, which could interfere with the vitrification in the brain, although that's a little bit speculative. But anyway, it causes a delay for the brain if you're having to also vitrify the body. So I recommend not perfusing the body. Next slide. This is going back to the sequence events. Again, I'm going to go through the sequence a bit more. Next slide. Medications, propofol, sedative and neuroprotective, epinephrine, we want to raise the blood pressure if we can. Heparin, streptokinase, heparin, most commonly used, very important against clotting. Try to stop acidosis. A lot of these are against ischemia and reperfusion. But cooling and cardiopulmonary support are by far the most important things you can do. Much more important than any of these medications. A lot of people just go haywire trying to get the right medications in and just forget that cooling is so important, so much more important. And a good cardiopulmonary support. Next slide. So I'm saying cardiopulmonary support. We're not doing CPR. We're not trying to resuscitate the patient by restoring the circulation. That's one reason why we give propofol, to keep the patient from regaining consciousness when we restore circulation. We do want circulation, however, because the circulation helps accelerate the cooling. We use mechanical compression, a thumper to improve the perfusion pressure over what you could do manually. Ice, if you just pack a patient in ice, it's not as good as using ice water, because the water will conduct heat away faster, and if the water is moving, it will conduct the heat away all that much faster. And as I say, having the blood circulating inside the patient helps conduct heat away from the core of the body to the periphery of the body. And if you can actually get a cold perfusion solution into the blood vessels themselves, then you can really get rapid cooling. So next slide. So this is sort of an example of the ice bath we have. It's the ice water and the ice water we're going to use this bath with the patient, and we have this thumper, this device that's going to mechanically apply the cardiopulmonary support and get the blood moving again. Next slide. Just to clarify a few definitions which I've been using, but maybe could use better clarification. Perfusion is injecting or circulating fluids through blood vessels. It's distinct from diffusion, where you just have movement of molecules and liquids due to random motion and concentration gradients. Standby is when you have people waiting by the bedside for a terminal patient to have their heart stop and be pronounced dead. And stabilization is the process of cooling, cardiopulmonary support, and medications that's begun immediately after pronunciation of death, hopefully. Next slide. And another important word is ischemia, which is no blood flow. And if you get no blood flow, then obviously the tissues can't get any oxygen or nutrient. And ischemia not only damages the body tissues by not giving them nutrient and oxygen, but it makes the blood vessels become more leaky. And we distinguish between warm ischemia and cold ischemia. Warm ischemia would be what happened if there was nobody to start cooling immediately. If the person's just laying there, their heart stopped and they're warm. They're not even being cooled or anything. Cold ischemia, almost all Cryonics patients experience this. If they deanimating outside of Michigan or Arizona, they're going to be packed in ice and sitting in ice. Next slide. So then there's reperfusion. Now it's great. What you want to, you want to start the blood flowing again after the heart stops, if you can. And if the heart has just stopped and you apply CPR or a defibrillator and get the heart going again, the heart will start getting nutrient and oxygen immediately, and that's great. That's really helpful. But if too much time passes, actually starting the blood circulation can end up damaging the tissues more than if you hadn't started the circulation again. And that's called reperfusion injury. And oxygen plays a large role in this reperfusion injury. Oxygen is really helpful when, when you have a living tissue and you're not doing reperfusion, but if time has passed, oxygen can cause an awful lot of free radical damage in the reperfusion injury process. But reperfusion, oxygen isn't the only damaging thing that happens in reperfusion. Cytokines and other factors get involved. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, the reperfusion injury can also damage the blood vessels, or anyway, we can damage the blood vessels and increase their leakiness, so we end up with edema. So edema means that the tissues are swelling up with fluid. And so you try to do a perfusion, and you're perfusing all this fluid into the patient, and and nothing's coming out. You're just putting fluid in, nothing's coming out. Well, what's going to happen? You're going to blow up like the Michelin Man. And that's what happens in a lot of these cryonics patients. That's an exaggeration, but you just get fluid going in, no fluid coming out. And it interferes with perfusion. Perfusion is blocked. Edema is a major problem when you have ischemic cryonics patients. Next slide. So there's a lot of mechanisms of reperfusion injury. This is indicating some of them. But I want to point out edema. If you've got a lot of fluid in the tissue, it's going to constrict the blood vessels. So you can't get any circulation. All this water, edema fluid that you're pouring in is just makes it. We've had to stop perfusion because of edema. It happens too often. So here you're trying to perfuse from the arterial side to the venous side, going through all these capillaries. And when you've got edema or blockage through the other sources of blood vessel damage, what will happen is the blood will take the path of least resistance. So if there's one path or a few paths that are not very much blocked, all the blood will go through there. The other paths are not getting much or very little. So or some of them are getting some flow. So you'll have some areas you're trying to vitrify the patient, put a vitrification solution through. You'll get some areas that are getting full vitrification, good saturation of vitrification solution. Some that are getting no vitrification solution and you're just getting freezing, and some areas that are getting a little bit of vitrification solution or some vitrification solution and reduction in freezing. Next slide. So by doing a blood washout, you can improve matters somewhat. You can get rid of a lot of clotting and blood cell aggregation, and you can. If you're shipping a cryonics patient, you can replace the blood with an organ preservation solution, which will help protect the tissues. And also, you can, if you're able to perfuse with a cold washout solution, you're not only clearing out all the blood to reduce clotting and other factors, you're also able to cool the patient very rapidly. Much more rapidly than with external cooling. Although then again, it takes time to do the surgery to set up a washout. And also, if you don't do it properly, you can end up causing reperfusion injury with your washout. And the washout is not going to prevent the cold edema you have due to the cold ischemia of shipping in ice. Next slide. So there's a company in Oregon run by Ashley and Shauna DeWolf that's doing research for the Cryonics Institute on these problems. And they've discovered actually perfusion solutions that can improve perfusion despite edema and reperfusion injury. And they can get good perfusion of ischemic patients that experience 24 or 48 hours of cold ischemia. Clear out those blood vessels just by using the right solution. Now these are people who are working on weekends and they do great work, and it would really benefit cryonics if there was money available for them to do research full time. So that's my pitch for them. Next slide. Now when there's a washout or a whole body perfusion, this is the surgery that's done. They go through the femoral artery and the femoral vein are cut, and the perfusion solution goes backwards, reverse the normal flow through the femoral artery up to the arch of the aorta, bypasses the heart, goes to the arch of the aorta throughout the body, In returning to the superior vena cava, it bypasses the heart again, goes down the femoral vein, and out the femoral vein to be recirculated. Next slide. So there's the blood. We got two sets of arteries going to the brain. We've got the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. The carotid arteries are large arteries more towards the front, and the vertebral arteries are running up the vertebrae, and they're smaller and they're towards the back. And once they reach the brain, though, the flow from the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries get united in the circle of Willis to distribute through the whole brain. Next slide. Go back again. If you're doing a vitrification perfusion, in theory, you don't need to worry about the vertebral arteries, because you could just perfuse into the carotids, because it would get up there to the circle of Willis and go through the whole brain anyway. So that would make the vertebrals not so much of a thing to worry about because of this circle of Willis. Next slide. But the circle of Willis isn't always complete. As a matter of fact, most people do not have a complete circle of Willis. This study showed only 42% of cases had complete circle of Willis. It's most often complete in women and young people. And another study was a bit more optimistic, looking at healthy people aged 65 to 68, found that just only a little bit less than half had a complete circle of Willis. So how do we do vitrification if the circle of Willis isn't complete? Next slide. Well, you have to try to go through the vertebrals as well as the carotids, it seems like. Now, when Alcor does the head perfusion, they separate the head from the body, and then they put the head in a container that filters and recirculates the vitrification solution. And they perfuse through the carotid arteries. Initially perfusing through the carotid arteries, let's put it that way. They only perfuse into the vertebral arteries if they don't see perfusate dripping out of the vertebral arteries. So if they see dripping perfusate, that means the circle of Willis should be complete. Otherwise, how could it be coming down the vertebral arteries? If they don't see the dripping perfusate, then they would cannulate the vertebral arteries and perfuse through both the vertebrals and the carotids. And this procedure also is good. It allows independent monitoring of each hemisphere. Doing the head independently in this box has this advantage that you can look at each hemisphere independently and make sure each hemisphere is being perfused. Next slide. So Alcor, when they're doing their head perfusion, they put holes in the skull, which are called burr holes, which allows them to monitor brain shrinkage and cracking on cooling. So it actually turns out the vitrification solutions they're using, if the patient doesn't have ischemic damage, and the blood vessels aren't leaky, the vitrification solution doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier well. It doesn't get into the brain. And an Alcor patient who has very little ischemic damage is mainly vitrified by dehydration rather than the vitrification solution. And so they're watching through these burr holes, they're watching the brain shrink, and they consider the brain's been vitrified after it shrunk to 78% of its original volume. Next slide. As I mentioned, before 2005, the Cryonics Institute was only perfusing through the carotid arteries, and glycerol is what was previously used. But anyway, only perfusing upward through the carotids to perfuse the head, and downwards through the carotids to perfuse the body. And these are the cannulas that we use and are still used. Next slide. And as far as the surgery, what we're trying to do now, what we've been trying to do since 2005 is get those vertebrals into the vitrification perfusion. And so we try to perfuse into the ascending aorta, we open the chest, perfuse into the ascending aorta, clamp off the subclavian arteries that are going to the arms, clamp off the descending aorta that's going to the body, and that way, just by perfusing into the ascending aorta, the vitrification solution can go through both the carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. Next slide. So, the United Kingdom has requested, people in the United Kingdom don't like the idea, and of course everybody in Europe doesn't like the idea of spending 3 days in ice before you get your vitrification perfusion in Michigan. And as I indicated, it's not very good perfusion when you've got a lot of cold ischemic damage anyway, even though we're using a vitrification solution. So in January I sent Cryonics UK people some vitrification, some of the CI vitrification solution. And the protocol I have is for them to perfuse the head with vitrification solution through the carotid arteries. There's no perfusion provided through the vertebral arteries. And the patient would then be shipped to the United States in dry ice. So what does this mean for the patients with incomplete circle Willis? Well, one thing you can say is perfusion after 3 days in ice. And just by going through the carotids, you're going to get a better perfusion than you might get otherwise. You probably get otherwise. At least you get good vitrification in many areas, even if not in all areas. That could be one argument. But there's actually more to the story than that. Next slide. So actually, out of about 15 to 20 neuro cases that Alcor has done, in no case have they ever perfused to the vertebral arteries, because they had never seen, in all cases, they see dripping of the vitrification solution through the vitrification arteries. So I don't know, what sense do we make of this? Well, actually, a couple of years ago, there was a study done showing subjects, 60% of which had an incomplete circle Willis, which is pretty typical. But during unilateral perfusion, with functional testing, they showed no evidence of insufficient perfusion of any parts of the brain. So there must be some extracranial collateral circulation going on. And if that's the case, we've been wasting an awful lot of time and effort trying to, in Cryonics Institute for sure, trying to perfuse through open the chest and perfuse through the ascending aorta, because it's very complicated and we often run into a lot of problems, and there's still a lot of bugs in the procedure, frankly. Next slide. I'm going to talk about the vitrification mixture. Oh, by the way, I just want to mention, this is such a critical paper, I brought a copy of it, if anybody wants to look at it. So, let's talk about the vitrification mixtures. Alcor uses a vitrification mixture called N22, and the Cryonics Institute uses one called VM1. They're both mixtures of cryoprotectants, as I mentioned, which makes them less toxic. They solidify at about the same temperature, minus 123. Next slide. This will show you N22. It's a very complicated formula, a mixture of cryoprotectants. So this is Cryonics Institute's very simple formula. They're both in carrier solutions. The N22 costs about $170 a liter. The CI's VM1 costs about $1 a liter. This is one of the reasons why that motivates closed-circuit perfusion by Alcor, where they recirculate everything, and that's because they're using such an expensive vitrification solution. Maybe if they, as it is, they're spending about $16,000 a case on their vitrification solution, and if they didn't recirculate it, it would be astronomical cost. So they have to use closed-circuit perfusion. Whereas, anyway, I haven't discussed closed and open-circuit perfusion, but let's move on. So, next slide. One reason why this is more about the Cryonics Institute's vitrification solution. We use industrial-grade ethylene glycol, DMSO. Industrial-grade, well, that's pretty shocking, but it isn't as shocking as all that because it's really about 99% pure. And the major impurity by far is water. And water is not an impurity, for research labs and so forth, if they have an impurity, water impurity, that's going to cause them a lot of worry. But for us, water is just fine. We're using lots of water anyway. Next slide. So just to mention a little bit more, I mentioned already about the blood-brain barrier. Blood-brain barriers is blood vessels or capillaries around the brain, and they're less permeable than normal capillaries, and so that forms a barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is not very permeable to these cryoprotective agents unless it's been damaged by ischemia. And most of our patients, most Cryonics Institute patients, frankly, have suffered enough ischemia to cause them to cause the blood vessels to be leaky. And so the cryoprotectant is probably crossing the barrier okay. So, and as I mentioned, where there's a non-ischemia, where there isn't a lot of ischemia, the vitrification is mainly by dehydration rather than cryoprotective agents. Next slide. So I mentioned that the tissue solidifies about minus 123, but once you've got a vitrified solid, and you start cooling, the slow thermal conductivity of the solid from the outside means that the outside is cooling faster than the inside. And when the outside is cooling faster than the outside is going to contract more than the inside during the cooling. And that contraction is going to create thermal stress, which can cause cracking. And so cooling from minus 123 liquid nitrogen temperature, the faster you cool, the more cracking you can get. Next slide. Now, if you've got a very small sample and you cool slowly enough, you can avoid cracking. Dr. Brian Wolk has cooled a vitrified rabbit-kidney, which is pretty small, only 10 milliliter volume, from minus 123 to minus 126 with the nitrogen for over 2 days. No cracking at all. So a very small volume, a very small organ, you don't have the cracking problem. Next slide. So in theory, if you cool the cryonics, in theory, if you were able to cool the whole cryonics patient, even the brain, slowly enough, from minus 123 to minus 126, you could also avoid cracking. But how slow would that be? We don't even know. It could be months, could be years, very long time probably, and it's just impractical for us to try cooling over that kind of time period. If we could somehow improve the thermal conductivity in brains of Cryonics patients, that would help reduce the cracking problem, but there's no technology yet to do that. Next slide. So this is the protocol we've been using. Cool as rapidly as possible this is a Cryonics Institute patient wearing the lights. Cool about as rapidly as possible to solidification temperature minus 123. Stay there for a few hours. And then cool as slowly as possible, not as slowly as possible, cool over a period of days to a liquid nitrogen temperature. The idea is if you're going to cool if you cool very slowly, at least you'll get probably less cracking than if you cool rapidly. But we still know we're going to get cracking. Next slide. So actually, Dr. Grant Fay, cryobiologist, did some experiments in 1990 with samples of about a half a liter samples, and he showed that below the temperature at which the sample solidified, you just can't avoid fracturing. Next slide. But if you cool really slowly, you've got a problem of if you cool really slowly and you have no cracking up to a point. The cracking is worse if the cracking begins at a lower temperature than it is if it begins at a higher temperature. So the cracks get finer and finer. So if cracking is inevitable, you might as well crack at a higher temperature rather than a lower temperature. Get the thermal stress over with as soon as possible and avoid this kind of mess, this kind of cracking. Next slide. So the Cryonics Institute revised its protocol in light of this data and putting in a rapid cooling step, a rapid cooling to force cracking at a higher temperature. Next slide. So for Curtis Henderson, this was the cooling protocol we did. We held it about minus 100 Celsius for a day, and then about minus 120 for a day, and then rapid cooling to force the cracking at a higher temperature, and then exponential cooling after that, slow cooling to liquid nitrogen temperature. Next slide. So actually, propylene glycol actually vitrifies at a fairly high temperature. So, and the experiments done in 1990 were being done with pure cryoprotectant solution. And actually, there's less thermal strain in biological tissues that have been vitrified than there is in pure cryoprotectant solution. Next slide. So another alternative approach has been an intermediate storage temperature. Why not just store the patients at minus 140, which they'll be in a solid vitrified state, and just keep them at that temperature instead of going down to liquid nitrogen temperature and avoid the cracking. But it's going to be much more expensive. A system was sent to Alcor in December 2008, and they're still evaluating it. To figure out how to implement it, or whether they want to implement it even. And the Cryonics Institute has no plans for an intermediate storage temperature system. Next slide. There's also a possibility of radiation damage. Cryogenic temperature doesn't prevent ionizing radiation or breaking of chemical bonds. But that's going to happen in any case. But it can protect against radiation damage by reducing the mobility of reactive species generated by the radiation. The lower the temperature, the less these free radical species are going to be. The less mobile they are, and the more protected you are at a lower temperature. Next slide. And one experiment showing acetylcholinesterase enzyme X-ray radiated showed conformational change at minus 118 Celsius, but not at minus 173. And X-ray irradiated insulin crystals showed 4 times as much damage to disulfide bridges at minus 173 degrees Celsius at minus 223 degrees Celsius. So you get some protection by having a lower temperature from this radiation damage. During 8-cell mouse embryos that were stored for 5 to 8 months in liquid nitrogen and subjected to about 2,000 years of background gamma ray radiation showed no effect on survival or development. So liquid nitrogen temperature seems to be pretty safe, at least from this evidence, safe from radiation damage. Next slide. So how bad is the cracking problem really? You've got a lot of things to fix. If you break a vase and you break it in 3 or 4 pieces, you can patch it together pretty easily. And the more pieces you have, not the same thing as being pulverized. And certainly, cracking problem is not as bad as the freezing damage. Freezing damage is much worse. You're really pulverizing the tissue. So is it really worth going to a lot of effort to eliminate the cracking problem when you have so much else to repair anyway? I mean, it sounds like a cynical view, but it's not cheap. Intermediate temperature storage. Next slide. Just to show you the storage vessels we use at the Cryonics Institute, we use these fiberglass thermos bottles basically, and Alcor is using these Deloirs, which are steel thermos bottles basically. Next slide. And as I say, they're steel. The Deloirs have a high vacuum. The vacuum holes. The cryostats, the vacuum has to be pumped every other month, and we add perlite insulation plus the vacuum. But reputedly, cryostats are twice as efficient for size as steel vessels. The fiberglass resin conducts heat much less readily than steel, so there is an advantage to fiberglass resin. Next slide. So just say a few words about reanimation repair. This is not a subject I spend much time thinking about. I really don't think I can figure out what future technology is going to be able to do. my emphasis is almost entirely on how can we preserve the structure as best as possible, and the future technology is going to have to figure out what to do, and it's going to involve things that are just we can't know about right now. But we should know enough about it, or think enough about it, probably to think it's reasonable that it will exist. So one thing, what about repairing all this damage? How are we going to repair all this damage from nanomachines and nanobots? If we've got a damaged patient with a lot of cracking damage and freezing damage and so forth, and needs to be rejuvenated. If we warm that patient up, it's going to turn to mush. We really want to warm the patient up and get these nanomachines working on mush. What good is that going to do us? So it seems like we're going to have to, we're getting a liquid phase, possibly above minus 123. So even if biochemical reactions are halted, the diffusion is not halted. You can still get loss of structure. Next slide. And so how would these, if we're going to do repair at cryogenic temperatures, how are these tiny robots, these nanobots, going to move around? And how are they going to have enough energy to make and break chemical bonds? And how can they be powered at these temperatures? What's the power source? And how can billions of these nanobots communicate in a wireless fashion? Next slide. Well, Ralph Merkel and Robert Freitas have some suggestions. They say that you can have dynamoid molecular machines and nanobots that can operate at these temperatures. They say that they can be powered by electrostatic motors. I don't understand that one. But anyway, and also 80% of the brain is water or cryoprotectant. So you can drill through a lot of the brain. These little machines could drill through a lot of the brain, all the solid at cryogenic temperatures without damaging subjects, structure, as long as they know where they're going. And you're not in a hurry. If you're repairing at cryogenic temperatures, you can spend years doing the repair necessary before warming up to higher temperatures to do further repairs. Also the nanobots, if they can communicate with external computers, they could do massive computation. The external computers could take on a massive portion of the computational burden that would be required. Next slide. So if none of that works, as a last resort, you could do destructive analysis of the brain and use at cryogenic temperatures. You digitize the information and use that to construct a brain with new material. And you have the microfilm slicing and recording the brain at the cryogenic temperature. And once you have all that information, you can make duplicates of you. Next slide. So just one more plug for Asher and Sean's company. As they say, they're weekend researchers. It would be great if there was money for them to work full time. They can investigate things like reperfusion injury, improve perfusion for ischemic cases, which they've already been doing, reducing cryoprotectant toxicity, and other issues of interest to cryonics. But you won't get conventional medical researchers investigating any of these topics. It's just what we're interested in, what conventional medical researchers are interested in is so different that we just have to do this work ourselves. Next slide. And that's where you go for further information. Thanks. I think I went over time. Nobody stopped me. There'll be plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, we're well in time, so we can have several questions. If nobody, I'll give you a minute because I've got one. Michael, then you start.
I think it was like 22 when you said that persons being dead for 2.5 hours had up to 90% survival rates of brain cells, I think.
The neurons, right?
The neurons, yeah.
Those are neurons.
At which temperature were they laying the persons?
Oh, I don't know, but I would assume that they were just normally, when a person dies, they're taken to the morgue and kept, cool at probably minus 4 degrees Celsius.
-4.
Yeah, but it also takes them a while to cool down too. They're not putting in an ice bath. So,
Okay, thank you.
Quick question for those sitting at the back. Could you understand the question well, or should we have it repeated over the microphone?
Volume is good for me, but I'm good question.
Okay. David.
Yeah, you mentioned protein-9 blockers, Ben. Do you know if there's a pressing reason that they're not being used in cryonics?
well, the most important, the most valuable, well, they are being used in cryonics. The Alcor uses them. There's ice blockers in N22. The Cryonics Institute doesn't. The Cryonics Institute VM1 is much more a stronger cryoprotectant than N22. N22 is the cryoprotectant, the vitrification solution that was used to vitrify these rabbit kidneys and bring them back. So there's a lot of emphasis with N22, what they're doing to minimize toxicity and to increase viability. And so by using ice blockers, you can have a less toxic cryoprotectant. But a much more expensive cryoprotectant. The Cryonics Institute, we're not focused on rewarming. It's just not. Our goal is to preserve structure as best we can, and as cheap, as efficiently as we can, and cheaply as we can, frankly. And so using expensive ice blockers when we had no, we're hoping the future technology can have to do a lot of repair anyway. So I don't see any point for the Cryonics Institute using ice blockers. And as I say, what Alcor uses is they're using the same thing for their cryonics patients as is being used for the kidney work and the other research done by 21st Century Medicine.
I wonder if there's no damage if you start the perfusion very early. There may be small damage which you cannot demonstrate. Is it be right?
Not sure I understand your question. The sooner you do cooling or the sooner you do perfusion, the better. I mean, what I have for the UK, what we have set up for the UK is based on the idea you're not doing a cold washout, you're not doing shipment. You're going immediately to vitrification. You're vitrifying as soon as you can, and so you don't need to wash the blood out, and you can get cooling. You can be cooling the patient with the cold vitrification solution, and you're cooling internally by doing the vitrification perfusion immediately as soon as possible, and so doing everything as quickly as possible, as soon as possible. Certainly will help the situation. I don't know, does that answer your question or not? Go ahead.
I try to explain. If you give oxygen very early, you have no reperfusion damage.
Right.
I doubt that this is so. I think there's a very small damage which you cannot demonstrate. Therefore, I wouldn't do this. No CPR, no oxygen.
I see. Well, I disagree, but it's begun quickly enough. I mean, let's face it. If people fall down and they've been lying on the ground for a minute, and somebody comes along and uses a defibrillator or uses their hands to administer cardiopulmonary resuscitation, the person will get up and recover. And as far as I know, I mean, one of our members at the Cryonics Institute has had this experience, and he seems like a fairly bright man to me. If he has neurological damage, it was very small.
Okay, we have a question over here, and then so you first.
I think the answer is money, but what about an X prize for bringing small animals down to freezing and back? I think that there's a lot of members, at least I know in Alcor, that are quite wealthy. Probably you have many members too that maybe could be interested in supporting an X prize. Have you thought about an X prize?
Well, I don't think that's the route to go myself. If somebody else wants to do it, that's fine. Actually, I have a complaint against, this is the direction of 21st century medicine research is statification. And I think shouldn't be the highest priority. I think the number one, if I'd like to see all that money devoted to focusing on the question of cryoprotectant toxicity. What is cryoprotectant toxicity? What are the mechanisms of cryoprotectant toxicity? What can we do to minimize it? That's really a more primary step than whole body vitrification. I think that's where I don't know, an X prize for eliminating cryoprotectant toxicity doesn't sound so exciting, but it's really at the core of everything. So that's as much as I want to say about that at the moment.
Yes, Sebastian?
By the way, at 21st Century Medicine, they're certainly doing a lot of good work, and it's certainly their money to spend as they please. One of the reasons they're doing that is because the principals are whole body patients themselves, and so they want to improve the whole body vitrification procedure, rather than just have the neuros getting the best treatment.
Thank you, Ben, for a talk that was like one of your cooling person. You were starting off from a very basic level and then rapidly going into advanced problems. I wasn't quite sure what your conclusion was finally on the Circle of Willis challenge. So are you saying now that you don't actually bother with that? Or?
I have two pieces of evidence which are telling me that it may not be as big of a worry as we thought in the past. One, the Alcor experience. They've never during all the neuros, they've not once worried about perfusing through the vertebrals because they're always seeing percusate dripping. And the other, this study of unilateral perfusion, in which they see good functional perfusion of the whole brain, done in 2008. And I guess it's sort of hard when you see a couple of studies to say, okay, let's switch gears and go another direction. But it's certainly given me more confidence about the approach that I've encouraged the Cryonics UK people to take. And I would certainly love to just go back to perfusing through the carotids, chronic sensitive patients, because it's not a trivial process opening the chest and trying to clamp off the vessels going to the arms and clamp the descending aorta. There's a lot of things in the way. It can get messy. In some cases the descending aorta is perforated. One of our patients actually died of aortic hemorrhage, so there was no hope of doing it for that case, certainly. I would greatly prefer, it would greatly simplify things to go back to perfusing through the carotid, and we may, if I start feeling a little bit more confident than I'm feeling now, and the evidence is there, I think that would be a greatly preferred thing to do.
Second question.
Okay, first we have time for about 3 more questions, so I put you on the back and then we'll come back to you. Yes?
You described the problem to bring the vitrification mixture into the brain in very detail. So I just want to ask, do you or do CI also consider a direct injection of the vitrification mixture into the brain and then distribute it via diffusion?
Well, you don't perfuse tissues by injection. You get good saturation of tissue by injection. For one thing, you're not. Part part of what we're accomplishing in perfusion is not just putting vitrification in, but removal of water. And if you just do an injection, you aren't removing any water. And the water is what's causing your freezing damage. So by putting the vitrification solution in and leaving the water in, you're just ending up with a more dilute vitrification solution, which may not even vitrify. You'd have to, compensate for that by doubling the concentration of vitrification solution, which wouldn't be reasonable.
Or maybe in addition?
Pardon?
Or maybe in addition?
In addition, what?
In addition to the vitrification via the beans?
I don't know what you're saying. The vitrification solution is already 70% concentrated. You can't double it to 140%. That doesn't make mathematical sense. And you're just going to get, when you get a very dilute vitrification solution, it's not going to vitrify. That's the bottom line. You're going to end up with a lot of freezing. You want to get rid of the water. That's why you do this perfusion. You want to pull the water out and replace the water with something that's not going to freeze as much as possible. You're not going to get rid of all the water, but you want to get rid of most of it. So injection doesn't do it.
Weston, you had another question? I think you had a question already, so we'll take you next.
Oh, okay. Are there any ideas to reduce oxygen need at higher temperatures? There are some success with, I think, hydrogen sulfide or so to reduce the oxygen need of the body. This
Well, it would be,
animation topic.
it would be great if these procedures could work. For one thing, we could subject our patients to hydrogen sulfide that are being, out of state and out of country. People in Europe could get the hydrogen sulfide treatment, be put into a state of suspended animation and transported over to the United States for perfusion. It would be great if that could be done. I still haven't seen convincing evidence that this can be applied to humans. It's been done in mice and other small animals, but there's a lot of doubt as to whether this can be applied to humans.
Okay, Sebastian?
Coming back to the beginning of your talk, you took great care to emphasize that you see cryonics as a holistic endeavor that encompasses rejuvenation attempts. And then the rest of your talk, you refuse to speculate on that.
Refused?
To speculate on what those rejuvenation technologies might be. And,
well, I'm a supporter of Aubrey de Grey, although I have criticisms of some of his ideas. He was kind enough to publish one of my strongest criticisms in rejuvenation research, and but overall I support his approach.
So for you, that's inextricably linked. You couldn't do your technology without having...
Well, I wouldn't say inextricably linked, but on the other hand, I wouldn't look forward anywhere near as much to coming back, if I can live to 100, to coming back age 100 and still having to deal with infirmities of aging and possibly a worsening of conditions that are going to force me to die again in a few years anyway.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes?
Just a question to what you mentioned about researchers. You mentioned that the medical researchers seem not to be really interested in doing the work on the cryonics field. So have there been or are planned in the future any concrete initiatives to maybe sort of cross that border and raise that interest in the future?
Well, this is the approach that 21st century medicine has taken for years. I can't say that there's no overlap in the interest. 21st century medicine has focused on vitrification, improving vitrification for organ transplant. That was its mandate for most of its history. And So they've been looking at improving vitrification of corneas and as well kidneys. Kidneys has been a focus and other tissues as well. And so and by doing that, if they can succeed in that, if they succeed in kidney vitrification or cornea, improved cornea vitrification or other tissues, then there can be the medical community and the venture capitalists would take great interest in something that has prospects for application, and then there would be a lot more money by conventional medical researchers going into cryobiological research, organ preservation, which would yield results of benefit to us cryonicists. And you know, I'm certainly hopeful of that approach. But frankly, there are areas of interest in cryonics that just are not things that conventional medicine has any interest in. And you really need a focus. You need dedicated cryonicists doing that work.
Can I say something about that? Can I make a comment on that question?
Maybe since your talk is up next, we can...
It's not next, but it's okay. No, my point was that medical researchers depend on research grants, which their peers have to evaluate and grade. You can't put in a grant for preserving being immortal and get any funding. All researchers and even the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft will not approve such a grant, and researchers live on grant support unless you have a millionaire to support this type of research, which is really irrelevant to most of medical problems.
Or a billionaire.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben, again.